Kevin Pelton of ESPN joins us now. Tune in to the NBA Today free agency specials on Friday and Saturday on ESPN. And a good evening, Kevin. How you doing?
I'm doing well, ready for free agency to get going, although I guess it already has at this point.
Yeah, it has. There's a lot of stuff going on. It seems to me like this is going to be one of the most exciting openings that we've seen in a long time because of all the possibilities and all the teams moving to adjust to the new cap. Is that what it is?
It's interesting because I feel like a few days ago, the winds were sort of, James Harden's going to go back to Philadelphia. Fred VanVleet's going to go back to Toronto. And you're starting to think, okay, is this just going to be, Houston signing a bunch of role players? Is that what this free agency is going to be? But all of a sudden, the winds seem to have shifted. And obviously we have today's reporting from my colleague Woj that James Harden opted in with the intent of getting traded. It sounds like a much more realistic possibility that Fred VanVleet could leave Toronto. And that then has a ripple effect of creating other transactions to fill those holes.
And we're very interested in what you think is going to happen with Harden, but so much of our focus is on Kyrie Irving. And the last 24 hours has made a significant turn here as now there's talk of him meeting with the Suns. And we're trying to figure out how legitimate is this threat that somebody else could land Kyrie.
It doesn't seem all that legitimate to me. I mean, Phoenix in free agency is not going to have access to their taxpayer mid-level exception in all likelihood based on their salary. So they're offering him the minimum, or they're trying to convince Dallas to do a sign and trade. And, even then, what they could offer Kyrie would be very limited, and prevent them from re-signing any of their other free agents, which has been talked about as a plan for a long period of time. I mean, this seems like I don't want to say last ditch, but, a low chance effort for Kyrie Irving to create some leverage in his negotiation.
So because how much Phoenix has committed to other contracts, they could not do a sign and trade with Kyrie at the 50 or 40 million bucks the Mavs could give him. And on top of that, they couldn't re-sign their other free agents.
Yeah, not even close, because it is in the old CBA. This one carries over. When you complete a sign and trade transaction and get a player that way, it hard caps you at what is now the smaller apron of about 172.5 million. And Phoenix's payroll is already pushing. If you just look at the three guys, I mean, obviously DeAndre Ayton would go back to Dallas or be rerouted somewhere else as part of that trade, but they couldn't take back any other salary. It would have to be about $18 million. And then, like I said, minimums to fill out the roster if you're looking at staying under that first tax apron.
And then just to follow up and finish up on that, if they could get a third team involved, could it open up things more?
It would be necessary from the standpoint of Dallas would have to send out more salary if they're getting in DeAndre Ayton, or someone else would have to take in DeAndre Ayton. So it's kind of a necessary component, but it doesn't really help Phoenix that much.
Would the same apply if you would replace Phoenix with, say, a team like Miami, if they pivot from Dame and they decide they want to go in on Kyrie?
Pretty similar situation in terms of a lot of salary committed. Now, the one difference with Miami is if you imagine a scenario where hypothetically it's Tyler Hero is coming to Dallas as part of that trade. I don't know why Miami would necessarily want to part with Hero in that trade as opposed to waiting and seeing what happens to Damian Lillard. But for the hypothetical, and then you were to waive and stretch Kyle Lowry or trade him to another team that would just take his salary into cap space, Miami would be able to offer, I think, a larger first-year salary. I haven't run the numbers on that one. They wouldn't be as impacted as Phoenix because they've just got more salary they can offload, but similar limitations. It's not going to be the $47.6 million, that's for sure.
Now, from a Mavs standpoint, from a realistic free agent opportunity, it seems like Bruce Brown is going to be a guy they meet with pretty quickly. Grant Williams is another name that's been tossed around quite a bit. How do you feel like those guys would fit?
Yeah, I think those are the right kind of players to be talking about. Look, with Kyrie, assuming he's back, and Luka Doncic, Dallas has all the shot creation they're going to need. They need to upgrade the role players and their defense around those guys. That was what held them back last season after being so good the year before in their run to the conference finals. And you need those guys to be shooters to keep the floor spaced for Luka and Kyrie. Bruce Brown Jr., what he was able to do last year in Denver as a shooter fits that bill. Grant Williams, we've seen him do it in a playoff setting, not as much last season when he was in and out of the rotation as the year before for the Celtics. And the other nice thing about those players is, you contrast them, for example, JaVale McGee when he was Dallas's target and free agent last free agency last summer, those guys are right in the prime of their careers or even growing into their prime, not players you'd expect to kind of be declining at this stage of their career.
Did you like what the Mavs did from a draft standpoint?
I did. I thought, the two transactions they made played together pretty well. I think there's a good chance that Rashawn Holmes contributes more for them next season than Davis Bertans would have. He's going to be making less money. And in the process, you trade 10 into both 12 and 24 in the first round. And that to me is terrific value, especially given that, surely Derek Lively II was their target all. They had a pretty strong feeling he was still going to be out there even if they moved back 2 spots.
It's Kevin Pelton, ESPN, with you here in the GBag Nation. Can we follow up on Holmes? My understanding is they went so far away from the pick and roll offense that he thrived in, and at his age, maybe you could rekindle some of that magic and that production with Luka. What do you think?
That's definitely what's in that, and then kind of his frustration with that smaller role after he had been a starter prior to the Sabonis trade. So those combination of factors, it's not unprecedented for a player to kind of drop off the way that he did from one year to the next, but given that he's still in his late prime, it's unlikely that would happen. So I think it's a completely reasonable thought from Dallas that we could be getting someone rehabilitate back into at least a quality reserve.
Are you surprised that we're still seeing these guys do the super team stuff? And do you feel like the super team model still works?
It's definitely becoming more difficult than ever with the new CBA coming in and the limitations on spending because, part of the way that worked in the past is, Clippers were the ultimate example of this. You start out with cap space and you use that to get the guy or the guys, Brooklyn, another example of this. And then by re-signing your own young players and making trades and using the taxpayer mid-level, you build your salary to a point where all of a sudden you're spending a lot of money on role players in addition to having these, 2 or 3 highly paid stars. That process is going to be a lot more difficult now because it's more limited who's going to be able to use the taxpayer mid-level. You can't add as much salary in trades, things like that. And then also just the tax bills are going to be higher with some of the changes in the CBA this time around. But I think super teams are hard to kill. They're always going to be appealing in terms of putting stars together. That's, the clearest path to winning a championship, the kind of homegrown or built around one star like Denver did this season is the exception historically and not the rule. And it's also just, I think, fun for those kind of players to team up and play together, at least at the start. Sometimes it leads to trade requests down the road. So I don't think the super team model is going anywhere, but I do think it's going to be more difficult to take that path to a championship.
Kevin, do you like the way this is kind of playing out? Do you think it's going to make the NBA better? Or is this something that it's going to be taken? We're going to have to get used to.
I think we're going to have to get used to it potentially. I mean, I do think to some degree, my colleague Zach Lowe wrote about this era of parity in the NBA earlier this week. I do think to some degree that the changes in the CBA are probably less important than just kind of the way that injuries have become such a driving factor in what the regular season looks like and the playoffs. I think that's the bigger reason that, as many people have cited, we've seen 5 champions in the last 5 years. The first time, I think, since the late 70s, early 80s that we've had a stretch like that. I think having more teams feel like they have a chance to compete and win championships is a positive. But, people, there's nothing people dislike more than that super team that's dominating the league. But sometimes they tune in because of the fact that they dislike that super team.
Talking all things NBA with Kevin Pelton, ESPN, right here in the GBag Nation. What's the most interesting player or team when it comes to this week in free agency for you?
Yeah, I think Fred VanVleet, who I mentioned earlier, is going to be a pretty big domino. He goes to Houston, that suddenly changes their trajectory as an organization, puts them into legitimate contention, I think, next season, especially with, still probably another $30 million or so in cap space with which to fill out that roster. And then, it leads to some interesting decisions in Toronto. We've all sort of been waiting around for when the Raptors are going to make a decision on OG Anunoby and Pascal Siakam. And, if all of a sudden you don't have your all-star point guard who is part of that mix for a team that wasn't good enough to make the playoffs last year with him, I think it becomes a lot more difficult to justify keeping both of those players heading into the last year of their contract.
What about a guy like Draymond Green? It seemed like he has some interest, but is there any chance he actually leaves Golden State?
I'd be pretty surprised at that point. I mean, I think, all of us kind of naturally connected the dots when Sacramento made that trade on draft night and went up to $30+ million in cap space, but it doesn't sound like that's going to be, the fit that ends up making sense up here in the Pacific Northwest. There's been a lot of speculation about him meeting with Damian Lillard, but the path for him to get to Portland is complicated via sign and trade for some of the same reasons that Kyrie Irving leaving via sign and trade is complicated. So I don't think that's happening. I mean, I think the most logical outcome, especially after the Jordan Poole-Chris Paul trade last year, that could potentially save the Warriors, hundreds of millions down the road by getting out of a long-term Jordan Poole contract, that seems to portend he's probably going to be back in the Bay.
What'd you think about the Chris Paul move?
I mean, it's fascinating, the idea of pairing, perhaps the great antagonist of the Warriors during their earlier days with those guys. But, at this stage of his career, I think, bringing him off the bench potentially behind Steph Curry and playing those guys together maybe a little bit, but limiting his minutes makes a lot of sense. It's a way to help keep him fresh for the playoffs. So we can avoid some of these injuries that we've seen from him in past year playoffs. And, look, there is nobody who is a greater competitor, burns more to win than Chris Paul. So putting him with some guys who are some tremendous competitors with the Warriors as well, as long as they don't butt heads, I think it could be a potent combination next year.
Kevin, we've seen the Mavs have a newfound interest in like the tall, strong rebounding center. They, you mentioned McGee. They swung and kind of missed on him last year. I guess they were in on Drummond before he opted in this afternoon. What do you make of those types of players and how they help win in today's big scheme?
Yeah, I mean, I think, one of the lessons of last year's playoffs was the importance of size, especially size when you can pair it with skill, which is what Denver was able to do, where, they were able to play big and still have tremendous shooting on the court at all times. But, you look at the Lakers and when they went to Rui Hachimura alongside Anthony Davis and LeBron James, maybe not that 1 7-foot defensive anchor necessarily, or the two of those that you might see elsewhere, but still a lot of size across that front line. And, I think Dallas probably did get a little bit too small at times last season, and that hurt them defensively. I think Lively makes a lot of sense for them as a rim running center and someone who posted incredible block shot numbers at Duke. Holmes isn't that kind of rim protector, but fits offensively. Now, can you fit a third guy like that in there? And maybe if you're planning to not play Lively very much as a rookie and thinking of him as more of a long-term development play, then that third guy makes sense. But it wouldn't be what I would prioritize in terms of adding to the roster at this point.
What type of year one expectations do you have for Wembanyama?
I think the expectations are a little high for him right out of the box, just in terms of, right now he's still kind of figuring out who he is as a player and what he can do. And sometimes that means some low percentage shot attempts that, I think are going to, especially against NBA defenders, be more difficult than they were playing in the French league where he was MVP. Defensively, I think, he'll be very good from day one. Just his combination of, the incredible size and length and the athleticism that we see, his ability to, defend out on the perimeter and block threes. There's not a lot of players that anyone in the NBA has seen like that. And, I think that's going to make him a very difficult matchup defensively for opponents right away. But offensively, I'm looking at, a year or two down the road for him growing into that all-star kind of offensive contributor.
Where's Damian Lillard going to play his basketball this October?
So I would say right now, my guess is it's more likely than not that he ends up in Portland. All indications are that, after that meeting between Lillard and his GM and his agent, Aaron Goodwin, and the Blazers decision maker, Joe Cronin, that, they're going to approach the next couple of days as if Lillard is going to be on the roster, and they're going to attempt this thread the needle, which is the new catchphrase in Portland of, developing Scoot Henderson and Shaedon Sharpe and having those young guys as their future, but also putting a team out there that they hope can contend this year with Damian Lillard. And, I don't know if that's going to be enough to convince Lillard that he's got a chance to win right away in Portland without, trading some of that young talent for immediate veteran help. But, that may be a situation where he gives it another chance. And, then by the time the January, February rolls around, we kind of revisit everything with a little more understanding of whether they've been able to successfully thread that needle or not.